Salam. Thank
I
you.
see
Thank
you
you,
again. I
Christine.
think I listened to your remarkable panel discussion. Was it last week? Shukran kathir.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you heard it and enjoyed it.
Yeah, a French professor from Montpellier, where I used to live, told me all about Sabeel in France.
Oh, wonderful.
I think he knows your brother or somebody. I don't know.
My brother Daoud. Yes, I
Maybe.
see.
Yeah. Philippe Doma.
Philippe Dumas. Yeah, I remember Philippe.
Oh, you do? He's doing
Yes,
well. He's
yes, yes,
retired
yes,
now.
yes. Yeah.
He was a colleague of mine when I taught English at the University of Montpellier. He's a great professor.
Wonderful, wonderful. And where are you now?
I'm in conservative Norfolk, Virginia. It's a very military city
I'm
with
very
14 army
familiar with it.
bases. I don't know
I'm
why I'm
very
here, but the
familiar with it.
Palestinians were many of us, and we fight hard, and we're doing well with our films and open mics called Palatoons and doing all we can.
That's good. That's good. It's good to know who's out there, who's helping. There are a lot of people who are working. I think we're lacking a sort of national organization, but there are a lot of people, very good friends of Palestine and of peace and of justice throughout the United States. Okay, I think it is time for us to start. I will mention to you all that in this day of Zoom, I appreciate all of you who have shown up, and I will promise you that we will try to restrict ourselves to 1 hour and finish on the hour, because a person can only take so much on television, no matter how interesting the topic is. And I appreciate all of you who have showed here tonight. I know there are other competing programs, the Grammys, and for those who are into basketball, very important. But for all of us, I think 1 hour should be enough. I start by welcoming you. You're welcome here. This is a different and new kind of activity for FOSNA. It's more a literary one rather than an activist or a political one, although the topic is very political and very interesting. We're glad to have with us today the author herself, Alison Glick, of a new book called The Other End of the Sea. And she will be giving us a brief review of the book, and I will start engaging her with some questions and some conversation.
Oh, Jonathan.
And maybe she will even agree to read some portions of the book, and then we can all discuss it together. So I want to alert you to the fact that once we open it up for discussion, you can either hit the reaction button and raise your hand electronically like this, or you can place a question in the chat box if you prefer that, but we would like to hear from you directly. I will mention that this session is being recorded and is also being live streamed on Facebook. So if you do not wish your name or your face to appear or your comments to be directly attributed to yourself, you can block your video, use a pseudonym, or remove your name if you don't wish for your name to be known. With that proviso, I will introduce myself, Jonathan Kuttab. I'm the Executive Director of FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America. And I have with me Jesse Walker, my assistant and the officer in charge of development at FOSNA. So he will be reminding you, if you are not on our mailing list, to join our mailing list and to follow with our activities, which we have been quite active recently, and we hope to be even more active in the future. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Alison Glick, the author herself, to please tell us a little bit about your new book, The Other End of the Sea. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks to FOSNA for inviting me today. And thank you, Jesse, for all the work that you put into making this happen. Welcome, all of you. It's nice to see some new friends and old friends, people I haven't spoken with in some instances in many years. It's great to see that you're here with me tonight. Some of you are part of this story in ways that perhaps you don't know, but thank you for being here. I'll just tell you a little bit about how this book came to be in the world in the way that it is, and give you just a little bit of context and summary before I do a little bit of reading. And then I just hope to really engage with as many of you as possible, because I think a Q&A, a back and forth, is going to be much more interesting than hearing me talk about the book. But to that end, I lived in the Middle East for several years, and part of the time I was there as a writer, but I've always been either writing mostly for personal pleasure, but in the Middle East, I did write professionally. And when I returned to the United States in the early 1990s and continued writing, I always thought of myself as a nonfiction writer. And by the time I came back to the United States, I really tried to write about other things, my family, other things going on in the world. But no matter how hard I tried to not write about the Middle East, somehow my writing always kept coming back to that. And finally, I lived for several years in the DC area, not that long ago, and I was taking a writing workshop at the Bethesda Writers Center outside of DC. And when my piece, it was an essay writing workshop. And when my piece was workshopped, the teacher turned to me and said, "I don't know what this is. It's not an essay. I think it's a book chapter. I think you need to write a book." So at that point, my piece was, of course, about something that happened to me in the Middle East. At that point, I gave up resisting, and I committed to writing what I thought was going to be a memoir, because I had categorized myself as a nonfiction writer. But when my editor at Interlink saw the manuscript, he said to me, "I think you should consider fictionalizing this, because you have a literary writing style naturally. And I think this book would be read by more people, given the topics that it deals with, if it were fiction, if it were a novel, because for many reasons that are beyond the scope of this discussion tonight, people are more likely to pick up a novel that's about Palestine, about war, about refugees, than they are a piece of nonfiction." So at first I panicked because of how I had thought of myself, but then I trusted my editor, decided to trust the process, and embraced the challenge, and found, in fact, that it tapped into a creative side of me that I hadn't really thought of before, I hadn't really taken seriously. I could create characters, create scenes, give them all, narrative arcs and backstories in ways that I couldn't do when I was working on a piece of nonfiction that technically needs to really be, 100% true, right? So that was it was a very liberating experience to me as a writer, and also was a lesson to me in terms of, the importance of not pigeonholing oneself. So in the end, I was able to do that, and I'm really glad that I was urged to do so, because I do think it's not only perhaps more accessible, but I think it's a better book in the end than it otherwise would have been. And just to talk a little bit about the book, for those of you who haven't read it, I certainly hope that you will. It's essentially a love story. The through line is a love story between the two protagonists, Rebecca and Zane, off of which I hang their backstories. And it's not a linear narrative. It's a narrative that starts, in one place in Gaza, and ends up in a very different place, but in between, because I weave in their backstories, there are scenes about, Rebecca's Eastern European Jewish heritage, and a scene of her family when they escaped their shtetl during a pogrom in the early 20th century. There's a scene that Rebecca remembers from her childhood around the time of her father's death. So there are many things that are woven into the narrative that I think not only give you a sense of the characters, but these various scenes kind of play off and resonate with each other throughout the book in a way that that I think works well. But the love story is not just a romantic love story between these two individuals. It's a love story of many things. It's a love story of ideals, the love of home, of family, of community. And for those of you who haven't read it, and I would urge you, and during this discussion tonight, to think, of course, about the themes of the book, what it's, quote unquote, about, but also to think more broadly about how you see yourself in this book, how you see your ideals in this book. Even if you've never been to Palestine or Israel, if you've never been to the Middle East, regardless, if you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or none of the above, what about the topics or the issues that this book brings up resonate with you in your life? Because that's what I hope this book brings a little bit into the world, is ways to see ourselves in situations that are, in theory, very different than our own. So that's what I'll say about the book. Maybe, Jonathan, shall I read just a bit from the opening? Or would you like to do Q&A first? You're muted.
Before you start, I really want to ask this question, because when I started reading the book, I said, oh my God, this sounds like a memoir. This sounds like a specific retelling of the life of a Western Jewish young lady in Palestine falling in love with a Palestinian. The chapters in the West Bank, in Ramallah, my goodness, you were walking the streets, you got arrested, you thought about going to Al-Haq in Ramallah. It's just like, this is exactly what happened. This is exactly what happens to many young Western ladies who go to Palestine, and they live that experience. I don't know about some of the other portions of the book, Tripoli, Damascus, a little bit less. Was it Tripoli or Tunisia where you were, where the Rebecca was? But I was saying, my God, is this memoir, or is this a novel? Is this fiction, or is this really reality? So please tell us a little bit about that, and
Sure.
the distinction between truth and facts.
Sure. Well, the book certainly draws very heavily from my own experience living in the Middle East for the years that I did. And the way that I like to answer that question without being too coy, but being honest, is everything in the book did or could have happened to me or someone else. And certainly as someone who lived there for several years, I was at an advantage from compared to a writer who maybe has never stepped a foot in that part of the world, right? So of course I'm going to draw on that experience, the sensory descriptions, the smells, the places where I was, the things that I did, certainly inform the writing, and in some instances are things that actually happened to me. But there are characters that are created, there are scenes that are created, as I said earlier, that are meant to enhance the narrative, to give the reader context without the book sounding like a news report, because that's not what I wanted it to be. And to serve the overall narrative and the love story or love stories that I think, resonate and are woven throughout the novel. So if we want to, pigeonhole it, even though I just talked about how I don't like to do that, if we have to find a genre, sorry, I won't use the word pigeonhole, let's call it an autobiographical novel or autobiographical fiction. There's a genre, or I guess it's a subgenre, called autofiction. Frankly, I don't really know what autofiction is, but some people have referred to it as that. So yeah, and but it's definitely fiction. I mean, it lands solidly in fiction. For all of the reasons I think I've just mentioned. But I'll take that as a compliment that things are so.
Well, I was thinking about how it would compare to maybe some of the writings of Raja Shahadi, who writes very eloquently, but it's nonfiction. He writes about things that happened to him personally, or that he observed personally, or his reactions and his emotions to his life, or somebody like Father Shakur's Blood Brothers. It reads like a story, but it's a reality that he is referring to. There must be some proper definition for that genre, but it's different from what you're doing, because you're giving yourself the freedom to say things which didn't happen, but which you say could have happened, or happened to somebody else.
Yeah, and I think books like Raja's are considered creative nonfiction. That creative part of that type of nonfiction writing is exactly what he does. And it's what I think the original manuscript was as a memoir. And I've read memoirs that I consider creative nonfiction as well because of the writing style. But I think we decided it was important, we meaning Interlink and I decided it was important for this to be able to be sold and marketed as a novel, because it would have a wider readership, we hoped. Okay. So that was ultimately the decision.
Before I move on to my next question, I'll give you a chance to read a portion of your choosing so that people will get a flavor of the book.
Okay. I'll start. I'll start at the beginning, chapter 1, which is called Departures, and then maybe I'll read later on one or two other shorter excerpts. But this will just, for those of you who haven't read it, it gives you a flavor of, how it starts and a little bit of the characters involved. So chapter 1, Departures. We made our way through the nearly deserted streets, hoping to find a way out of Gaza. I sensed the rising nervousness of my friends, all of us expats living in the West Bank town of Ramallah. We crossed the main drag, Omar al-Mukhtar Street, and headed toward a parking lot. The sound of the cold winter rain echoed off the metal roof taxi stand as we approached. With the weather and the political tension of the first Intifada in 1988 combining to keep most people home, we weren't exactly sure what our transportation options would be. We entered the lot and noted one lone taxi. The sound of its idling diesel engine emitted a distinctive rhythmic knocking. Known as Service, these 7-passenger Mercedes sedans provided virtually all the intercity transportation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip of the late 1980s. Normally, the Service departed when filled with passengers, 3 in the middle back seat, 3 in the seat behind, and 1 in the front. There were 6 of us, so we would need to wait for another passenger or pay for the empty seat. But as the stand where the car stood came into full view, we noticed another man standing there, smoking, huddled against the cold. He took one last drag from his cigarette, squinting through its curl of smoke, inhaling deeply and sighing a grayish-white stream into the moist air. He flicked the butt downwards and ground it into the cracked asphalt with the tip of his shoe. His heel wavered back and forth, as if he were bidding the cigarette goodbye. At least now the taxi would be full and the driver would leave for Ramallah. We were a small group of school teachers from the Quaker-run Friends School, looking for a way to be useful since the Israelis had closed down all Palestinian schools in the West Bank. We had spent 2 days visiting hospitals, houses, and refugee camps, taking statements from victims of Itzhak Rabin's policy of force, might, and beatings, a failed attempt by the then Israeli Prime Minister to crush the Palestinian uprising by literally beating the population into submission. Soldiers set upon people indiscriminately, whether or not they were involved in a demonstration or other political activity. Truncheon-wielding troops crushed the bones of victims whose limbs were held taut by other soldiers. In the fields and olive groves of the West Bank, stones were used to the same effect. The taxi bumped and splashed through Gaza's muddy streets, making its way north toward the Erez checkpoint. We introduced ourselves to the 7th passenger. His name was Zain Majdalawi, born and raised in Shalti refugee camp on the western edge of Gaza City. Zain was a student at Birzeit University near Ramallah. The full taxi buzzed with discussion of Gaza. It was our first time there, and the difference between it and the relative prosperity and calm of Ramallah was striking. Driving north about 20 minutes, we came to the junction at Ashkelon, the first Israeli city on the main road out of Gaza. As the taxi slowed to a stop, Zain, sitting directly behind me in the last seat, pointed out a building on the left that dominated the intersection. A sandy yellow-colored structure, 3 stories tall, with a few high-placed windows. It was set farther back from the road than nearby buildings. A whitewashed concrete wall topped with a spiral of barbed wire surrounded it. "That is Ashkelon prison," he said, "where I was held as a political prisoner." Our heads turned in unison to take in the imposing compound. "How long were you in prison?" someone asked. I glimpsed a courtyard beyond the front gate. Looming above it all was a watchtower with a machine gun trained on the ground below. 15 years, he stated matter-of-factly. Until now, I had been content to listen quietly from the middle seat, too tired and absorbed in thought to engage in general conversation, especially with this stranger. 15 years, I blurted out, turning around in my seat. For the first time, I saw his face completely. He had sea-green eyes that sparkled playfully. Naam, yes, 15 years. My gaze lingered on him as I struggled for a reply. None came. It was then that I noticed the hint of sadness folded into the lines that edged his eyes. So there's
Lovely.
an introduction to Zane and Rebecca.
It certainly draws you in. You want to hear more. But I want to pick up on what you started saying, that this style of writing may enable you to share the truth, if not the facts, with a much wider audience. So I would ask you, who is your intended audience? Who did you write this book for?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, frankly, is the Jewish community, particularly younger Jews who, as perhaps many of you on this call know, younger Jews, particularly Jews under 40, and that's certainly not my demographic, are questioning Zionism and the sort of myth of Israel that has been handed down to many of us unquestioningly. So I hope that this book furthers the conversation in the Jewish community and furthers that process of questioning, furthers the process of questioning what many of us have been told. But I want the book to be read not by the quote, the already converted. Of course, I hope it is read by my colleagues and comrades in Jewish Voice for Peace, in which I've been very active for many years. But I also, where I really hope it lands is in circles, to the political right of organizations like JVP, including J Street and those to the right, because I really want to, broaden the tent, to get beyond singing to the choir, because I think that's one of the ways, or perhaps the only ways, that change will really occur, as to bring more people, the truth about what really happens on the ground in Israel, Palestine, the impact that policies that are supported by our government and by the Jewish community, and frankly, by large parts of the Christian community, what the impact of those policies and what's done in our name. So those are the audiences that I hope this book will reach, and that I hope resonate, that I hope the book resonates with these communities.
Thank you. But do you think that such an audience would find the narrative that you present believable? After all, this is fiction. Wouldn't they think that you're making things up, that you are exaggerating, that you are presenting the Israelis or the occupation or the situation in the West Bank, as well as in the Arab world, in a way that's much worse than it really is? After all, this is fiction, and you have the right to do so.
Perhaps in another era, that might have been a challenge. But I think in this era of social media, of people live streaming what's happening, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Gaza, during yet another attack, all you need to do is, click on a Facebook link to see that, in fact, the things that I describe are probably quite, soft in comparison to the realities on the ground. I think what is challenging to some in the Jewish community, and I say this from having talked to a class at Franklin and Marshall College just a few weeks ago. I was in, the book was used in a course called Contemporary Jewish Voices. So the entire class, which was not solely Jewish students, but a lot of students in the class are Jewish, when I talked to the class, it was very interesting to see the body language when I first started, because there were a lot of students in the class who were like this, arms crossed across their chest, heads kind of down. But as the discussion wore on, and as, I asked them and told them everything's on the table. No question, is out of limits as long as it's asked respectfully and you want to engage in a conversation. So, ask me anything. And I think that there have been, to my knowledge, and certainly in talking to this particular class in this particular setting, there were no questions about whether or not this was real. I think that they know that the situation is real. It's just a matter of letting in the reality. And I think that that's the struggle that they're undergoing. That's to the extent that any of them care to take on that struggle. I think that's where the struggle lies. It's an internal struggle. And it has to be done in a way that says there's another way to be a Jew in the world. Because these days, Judaism is so tied up with Zionism and with support for the Jewish state of Israel and its current, formation. Untangling that and saying you can be a Jew in a different way in the world. And it's okay. And there are many of us who are doing it. So I think that's the challenge.
Okay. I promised everybody that we will try to finish at the end of the hour. And I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions to ask, but I'll give Alison the chance to read another small portion from the book, and then we'll turn it to you for questions. I still have some questions to ask, but I will just let you read a small portion, and then we will hear from the participants.
And I'm happy to stay on if Jesse can keep the Zoom open if people have questions. I will keep this a little bit shorter. So I think this is appropriate for this particular audience. Without giving away too much of the book, I'll just set the context for this scene. I don't think it's giving away too much to say that Zane and Rebecca eventually marry. And in a situation that is rather fraught and unusual, that's all I'll say about the marriage. But right afterwards, Zane's brother Lutfi is taking Rebecca to Shati camp to meet her in-laws, in this case, meeting her father-in-law for the first time and telling them that Zane and Rebecca have married because they don't know it yet. And the reason why I won't say, you'll have to read the book. So this is that scene in Shati camp, or part of that scene. My first order of business was to visit Zane's parents, meet his father, and tell my in-laws that they were, in fact, my in-laws. I had met Zane's mother at his house a couple of times before we married, but his father never ventured out of the camp. So the Friday after Zane's arrest, Lutfi borrowed a friend's car and we drove the short distance from the house to Shati camp. Bouncing over the ruts and around the scorched remains of burned tires, we made our way to the alley where Omar and Asma lived. The labyrinthine blocks of one-story cement shelters gave way unexpectedly to wide swaths of sand that stretched for several meters. In the camp, they were known as Sharon Boulevards, after the young commander Ariel Sharon, who in the late 1960s burnished his rising military star by razing hundreds of refugee homes, depriving resistance forces of the ability to attack and take cover in the winding, narrow streets where tanks could not navigate. Thousands of refugees were once again scattered and made homeless. We turned off one of these boulevards and rounded a corner where a closet-sized store stood selling candy, cola, tins of meat stamped food aid, not for resale, and the occasional lonely-looking vegetable. 4 houses in was a door consisting of a piece of corrugated metal that thundered when we knocked. It reminded me of the Tin Man's chest when Dorothy verified his claim of having no heart. Mean, who is it? She called out. Anna, Lutfi, it's me, Lutfi. Hearing her voice on the other side of the door, I was reminded of her surprising response to me the first time we met. Asma had come one afternoon to visit Zain. He hadn't gotten home yet, so she and I sat together on the veranda, drinking sweet dark tea and watching the last of the sun's rays descend in a blaze of fiery reds and golds. Then, like clockwork, the sound of army jeeps seeped into the hush as the evening patrol of the camp began. What do they want from us? She asked of no one in particular. Befhamish, I don't understand. I didn't expect to hear her bring up politics, just having met me. But what she had to say turned out to be more about family and welcoming me. I remember what life was like in our village, in Simsim, she continued. We had Jewish neighbors and Christian neighbors and Muslim neighbors, but they weren't Jews or Christians or Muslims. They were our neighbors.
Nice. Thank you very much. You certainly evoke pictures, and I definitely would encourage anybody who hasn't read the book to read it. I want to give an opportunity to those who want to ask a question. You can do that either by raising your hand electronically in the little button that says reactions like this. So I can call on you to unmute yourself, or you can put the question in the chat box if you prefer that.
I've seen a couple questions come in the chat already.
Okay. I want to start with one of them.
Sure. Susan, thank you for the question about the title. I love talking about that.
Well, repeat the question, please.
Sure. It says, the question is, how do you choose the title, or how did you choose the title? Finding a title for the book was a challenge. And in the end, the discussion I had with my editor was, what does the book evoke? There's a lot of movement in the book, physical movement, people crossing borders, political movement, movement of, families and ideas and relationships, moving from one kind to another. So it seemed to be important to evoke that part of the book. And then the sea, of course, as the title, as the cover shows. And I love this cover. I fought hard for this cover. It's the camp depicted is an actual picture of Shalti camp. The sea is in the background, literally and figuratively, in so much of the book, in different places in the world where Zain and Rebecca land, or where Rebecca lived at different times in her life. So I love the fact that I was able to find this title that evokes both the movement as well as the sea being almost a character in the book in and of itself. So that's how the book, the title came to be.
Yeah, the same question is, since this is a fiction or autobiography, would you be concerned about any characters resembling real people? Some places you do mention real people, politicians, etc.
Right. And in fact, that was also one argument for fictionalizing it, is that I could change the names of people because some of them are still in the region, so I could protect their privacy. And it made it easier to do so in a work of fiction. Anyone who's, who was sort of in the public domain as a personality, as a public person, I didn't feel the obligation to do so. So I didn't, because I think, I don't know, somehow it lent a power and a gravitas to the book in a way that I thought served the narrative overall, but everyone else's name is changed for that very reason.
Okay. Any other questions? Trying to see.
Yeah. Someone asked directly to me, is the book available in Hebrew for the Israeli reader as well as Arabic for the Palestine public? No, it has not been translated, and I don't, at this point, there's not a plan to do so. And Interlink Books is a small independent press. So translation is, I think, an expensive project, but who knows? And I'm going to drop a link in the chat to directly to the Interlink site where you can order the book. And I just want to say also that all of the royalties that I receive for this book, I'm donating to an organization called We Are Not Numbers. It's an organization based in Gaza of young Gazan writers that I've been volunteering with as a writing mentor and as to help them with fundraising. So I would also encourage you to check out We Are Not Numbers and their writing. Randy has two questions. Have you had any offers to convert the book to another form, theater or film? Second, what is your next writing project? I personally think the book would make a great film. If anybody knows anybody in Hollywood, hook me up. So many people have asked that question. It's, this should be a movie. So that hasn't happened yet. The book's been out for about 4 months, so it's, I suppose, early days. Giving it good reviews on Amazon and Goodreads is one way to help get it attention. So just saying, if any of you are on do Amazon reviews or Goodreads. And for my next project, Randy, thanks for asking, and hi, Randy. I'm working with a couple other friends, actually one of whom is a former student who still lives in Ramallah. We're trying to put together an oral history project of the First Intifada, because we've realized that, at least in English and for a general readership, as opposed to maybe some scholarly tomes, there aren't really books about the First Intifada and what it meant, and certainly none that I think center personal narratives of Palestinians. So we're embarking on this oral history project that we hope will include a book of narratives by people who witnessed, participated in, or some way observed the First Intifada. And we'd love to also have it be on some kind of platform so people can hear these interviews in the voices of those who are being interviewed. And it was, the last time I was in Palestine, a young Palestinian American woman who was volunteering at Adamir, a prisoner rights organization, that summer, turned to me and said, no one here my age knows about the First Intifada, which was stunning to me. But of course, their lives have been dominated by Oslo and the, disaster that Oslo brought to that generation, and now really a second generation. And it's 35 years this year that the first Intifada broke out. So people, we're losing people who have stories to tell. So it's a much more ambitious and complex project that involves co-authors and, a lot. It's not the same as sitting at my desk, writing a book, but that's my next project.
Good. Francois.
Yes, thank you very much. Edouard and I are from France, you can hear that, but we have lived in this country for 50 years and we learn about those two organizations, Sabeel and GVP, through the Tree of Life. There is a group of Tree of Life on Cape Cod. I have two short questions. The first one, I am part of a group, women's group called the Daughters of Abraham, which is an organization that through books, through a book club, bring together the same number, there are 4 of each in our group, of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women. And through books, we talk not about the books so much as our own faith, religious affiliation, stories of life. And I want just to say that even so, we have learned a lot about each other through the 10 years we have already met. We never really addressed this question of the relationship between Palestinian and Israelis and Israeli and Palestinian. So I'm wondering if the book, your book, Alison, maybe you would open that. I must say we already read the book, Letters to My Neighbor, that maybe some of you know about. But it did not bring us as Americans with a certain political side of America, of USA, or the majority, I think, of the Jewish people and our Jewish friends. So do you think there would be more of an ouverture, opening through your book?
Thank you for that question, Francois. I think it is ideal for that purpose because it deals with, interfaith relationships. It deals, as the excerpt I just read, it allows one to imagine a world in which being a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian, meant something very different than it does now in the context of Israel-Palestine. And allows people to imagine, oh, so people had relationships as neighbors before, this state was created. What does that mean? What does that mean if you're a Jew? What does that mean as a Christian? And what does that mean if you're Muslim, or, really none of the above? It has what I call, I think, a moral imagination in the book, not just about this topic, but about other topics. There's a scene that I really love where Rebecca is describing or is relaying a story about when her parents first married. Her father was Jewish and her mother was Christian, and they had to elope because her mother's mother didn't want her daughter marrying a Jew. And they elope, and they're in they end up in the Jim Crow South. And there's a scene in the book, again, I don't want to give too much away, that really talks about how, you know, we can relate to each other in ways once we know a little bit more about how we came to be the people that we are. I mean, I think that the book allows one to kind of just imagine, I'm just going to keep using that word, imagine different ways of relating. And it, you know, it deals with difficult subjects. Zionism is going to come up. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe the Z word is off limits in such a group of, you know, interfaith dialogue group, or however you describe it. But the impacts, so you don't have to necessarily have a political discussion, but the impacts on people's lives and on families and former neighbors as a result of certain, you know, political decisions or policies are things that I think, you know, a group like that, if you're meeting on the basis of being, you know, religiously identified in certain ways, certainly those are topics that, you know, that such a group would want to deal with. I mean, these days, of course, the elephant in the room is Ukraine. And, you know, suddenly the issue of refugees and the acquisition of land by force and resistance are celebrated in ways that if you talk about those things in relation to Palestine, oh my God, you know, you hear the word terrorism, you hear, you know, the right of return being delegitimized, and you're called anti-Semitic if you call for such a right, but suddenly these rights are now being celebrated. So, you know, I think that because of the issues that the book deals with, and because of the world in which it has happened to land, I think it's a good place for discussion. And I think, yeah, to answer quickly another question in the chat from a woman in Colorado. Yes, I think, you know, book group discussions are ones, even small group discussions are ones that I would love to be a part of, or when it would encourage you to have. And yes, Janet, there was a time when one could go between Ramallah and Gaza very easily, before, you know, Gaza was under siege and cut off after 2006. It was a very, very different place in many, many ways.
There is a question in the chat box about what Palestinian or Arab authors have influenced you. And I guess people were thinking about some Palestinian authors who have struggled with these questions that you've raised.
Yes, I think Susan Abul Hawa, particularly Mornings in Jenin, is one. I love Diana Abu Jabbar. She's a Jordanian American writer, especially The Language of Baklava, which was a book that I think it's written as it's a family memoir. I believe that's how she has termed it. It's a book whose writing on the same page made me cry and laugh. There's a book written by Masoud Hayyoun, who is a Jewish Arab of North African descent, that came out last year or the year before, called When We Were Arabs. It's a nonfiction book, a memoir about his family, who were from North Africa and lived in Egypt and then immigrated to Paris and then eventually LA. That sort of reclaims the Arab heritage of Jews who have been, especially who come from the Arab world, have been, you know, almost forced in a way to give up their Arab identity after the creation of the state of Israel. But
you want to put the names of these three authors in the chat box?
Sure.
Hawa and
yes. Others, I mean, Arab. Well, she's not Arab, but I love Arundhati Roy is an amazing writer, and read anything she's written. She writes both fiction and nonfiction. Let's see, how do you spell Masood's name?
Masoud.
Yeah, I got it. And hold on, I have to look up. I'm looking at my bookshelf to make sure I spell. Yeah. But thank you for that question.
I was also thinking of Hassan Kanafani returning to Haifa.
Yes. Yeah.
Brings in the human element of a Palestinian baby who was lost, abandoned, whatever, in 1948, and who was raised, and then his family comes in 1967 and meets their son, who is now an Israeli army officer, raised by a Jewish family as a Jew.
So there's a question about the response of the Jewish community so far to the book. It's hard for me to say because it got a very brief and odd review in the Times of Israel, which is kind of, a very conservative outlet. I didn't really know what the reviewer liked or didn't like about the book. You can look it up and read it for yourself. I think he thought I was a little bit too hard on the Israelis. Shocking. So yeah, although in my defense, I suppose I should say that there are, a number of Israelis who are painted in very sympathetic light, including the Israeli woman whom Zane and Rebecca named their daughter after. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Okay, we're getting close to the end of the hour, and I promise to try and end in 1 hour, even though we are free to continue. But before we do, I want to encourage everybody again to read the book. In the chat box, you see how you can order it. And I'm sure Jesse will want me to remind you, if you're not already on our mailing list, to put your address or email address in the chat box so we can include you in our upcoming events like this one, but also other events that may be of interest to you. I want to thank Alison Glick again. This is a very interesting, wonderful opportunity. Do you want one last question, or do you want to give her a chance to read another portion of the book and end it in a very nice literary fashion? Alison, go ahead if you can find another portion.
Sure. Okay. This is short. This is the beginning of chapter 3, and it's called A Garden Blooms. The first time I visited Zane's house, a cement mixer greeted me as I walked through the metal gate surrounding the yard. The opening of the contraption where the ingredients were fed gaped empty. Black buckets of gravel and sand were abandoned around the machine, and a dusty water hose snaked around its feet. Opposite it, separated by a path leading from the street to the front veranda, was the garden. verdant and intricate with its bushes of fragrant basil, plain earthy potatoes, and showy trees of lemon and almond. I hadn't intended on going there, but with Zane, one's intentions could dissipate like drops of water in a hot skillet that dance on the surface and sizzle away. Our sojourns between Ramallah and Gaza had taken on a certain pattern through the winter and into the spring of 1988. I would contact him in Ramallah through friends or in Gaza through Tawfiq, the human rights lawyer. You can leave me at Faiz's, I would casually remind him about my plan to go to a friend's house as we emerged into the bustle of Gaza traffic. I'm inviting you to drink coffee, he would reply, as if this had slipped my mind. But I have an appointment. She's expecting me. At first, I could talk my way out of his car relatively easily, but with each successive trip, this push and pull became a ritual of our drives. So I tried being more strategic in my rationale for going straight to my friend Faiz's. She asked me to bring her some medicine from Ramallah that she's been waiting for. Really, just 10 minutes, he would reply lightly, almost laughing. Every time I saw Faiz's apartment building fade into the rearview mirror, I silently swore that I would never accept a ride with him again. But with each trip, Zane's plans, sprung on me as we got closer to Faiz's, grew more elaborate. Having coffee became lunch with friends I just had to meet. A brief errand morphed into visits that stretched out into the late afternoon. On one trip, I mentioned that I hadn't been to the seaside in Gaza. So he drove me to a remote swath of beach where I stood and watched the waves break along the empty shore, while Zane stayed in the car, watching me nervously. In the midst of the Intifada, Palestinians did not go to the beach. Then one day, he insisted on showing me the house he was building, in the garden of which he was so proud. Zane made tea and we sat on the veranda and took in the view. Shalti Camp, home to 50,000 refugees, and where he was born and raised, spread out before us 50 meters away. Beyond the camp, the Mediterranean shimmered. This was his Gaza. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Alison.
Jonathan. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, everyone. Very glad that you have joined us, and we will keep you apprised of additional information, additional activities. I see some good friends, some other authors. I see Alex Awad. I saw the Fines, who I'm sure will remember the Ramallah scenes very vividly, and other friends also I see. Thank you all, everybody.
And I've put my email in the chat if anyone wants to contact me. I'd love to address other books, other book groups, or engage with anyone who's interested. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Definitely, I will keep the site open for 2 or 3 more minutes. If
Okay.
anybody wants to go through the chat box and copy whatever addresses or information that's available there for you. As far as everybody else is concerned, thank you, goodbye, and good night.
شكرا كتير. مع السلامة. كويس. طيب.